Welcome to Comics Conversation, where I do my best to guide new Flash comic book readers through the sometimes confusing Flash reading order. Well, I guess this time I'll be stepping away from Flash comics, and in this video I'll be covering The Fourth World Omnibus by Jack Kirby. Some readers may not know what the Fourth World is, but before I go over what the Fourth World is, let's flash back to before the 1970s. The 1960s was an era in comic books that was regarded as having some of the most revolutionary comic books created, and this is because during that era of comic books, there were amazing creators such as Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, and Jack the King Kirby. Of course, these are just some of the creators that had a hand in the Silver Age of comics, but those three names are some of the most well-known creators and should be praised for all of the amazing work they have done. One of the many well-known comic book titles that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created was the Fantastic Four. Many people say that Stan Lee could not have created the Fantastic Four on his own, and that it was because of Jack Kirby that we have that cast of superheroes. Kirby was known as almost the idea man. Obviously, he was known for his artwork, but he was also known for all of his amazing ideas. Jack Kirby had been the one who gave the Fantastic Four life, and it was Stan Lee that gave that life form. With Kirby's ideas and Stan Lee's scripting, they are regarded as being one of the best comic book teams. I'm not trying to say that one is better than the other, they all did phenomenal work, but Kirby was a creator that left a huge impact on comic books as a whole. If you're interested in learning more about this, there is an entire documentary about Jack Kirby and a bunch of the projects that he worked on, and it can be found on YouTube, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. Anyway, this all had happened before the owner of Marvel at the time had sold the company to this larger corporation who knew nothing of the work that Kirby had done. Kirby was promised financial participation along with long-term job security, but once the company was sold, all those promises were either forgotten or denied. And this is gone over a little bit in the introduction to the Fourth World Omnibus by Mark Evanier, who would later write the New Gods for a while, as well as Walter Simonson, who would also later write the Orion series, and Orion is a character a part of the Fourth World, but I'll go into his character more in a little bit. This new corporation had thought that everything good on the pages had come from Stan Lee, and Jack Kirby was given no credit for any of the work he had done. This is what led to Kirby leaving Marvel Comics. We get to the early 1970s, and once he came to DC, he eventually got a contract to work on this project he had been wanting to tell. Jack Kirby was given almost complete control over the project he was working on for DC. The only thing he had to do was work on this pre-existing DC title that was not getting great sales, which was Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. And because DC wasn't too worried about what would happen to that particular comic book title, it just added to the amount of creative freedom Kirby had for whatever story he wanted to tell. With all that said, now moving into Jack Kirby's Fourth World Omnibus, we get introductions to some of DC's most recognizable characters. Now, not all of the characters are recognizable, especially in new comic book readers, but most people in general have probably heard of the evil tyrant Darkseid. Now, this is a pretty big book, clocking in at 1,536 pages. This collects New Gods 1 through 11, Forever People issues 1 through 11, Mr. Miracle number 1 through 18, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen number 133 through 148, The Hunger Dogs graphic novel, and a story from the reprinted issue of the New Gods number 6. So there was quite a bit of content in this book. A little bit of background to the Fourth World story is that it was originally supposed to be part of the Thor comic book title, and although I have never read any of the Thor comic book titles, it is said that there were little hints that were leading to the Fourth World, only it never came into fruition, and instead it was a story told as a part of the DC universe. Well, kind of. The intent of the Fourth World was that it had nothing to do with the DC universe, so Kirby could do whatever he wanted with comic book titles he was working on, and would only occasionally bring in Superman. Since it did include Superman and Jimmy Olsen, it was still a part of the DC universe, only it would not have an effect on any comic book titles outside of the Fourth World, at least not yet. Now I'm not sure, but I do not think that Jack Kirby expected for his Fourth World epic to have such a lasting impact on the DC universe as a whole. I mean, at the time, the comic book titles he was working on were not selling the best, especially since each issue was going for 25 cents. And although that does not sound like a lot now, at the time it was quite a bit more than 25 cents. But also, Marvel Comics went for 20 cents, while the Fourth World Comics went for 25 cents. For a kid, that was just basic math. If you had $1, would you get 5 Marvel Comics or 4 DC Comics? And most of the time, the readers would opt to go for the Marvel Comics since they could get more of them. But ever since the Fourth World originally came out, this mythology Kirby created for DC has expanded quite a bit. So much so that the New Gods would have crossovers with the JLA, several of the characters would get their own series, such as Orion and Mr. Miracle. They would play a role in multiple DC events, and the New Gods basically even had an entire DC event based around them, Final Crisis. which is one reason for me going over the Fourth World, because it helps to know who these characters are to understand what happens in the Final Crisis event. It is not completely necessary to read to understand the event, but it does add to the overall experience and enjoyment of reading Final Crisis, which I will be reviewing in an upcoming video, along with all the background reading that was required, or at the very least suggested to read to understand what happens in the event. Anyway, the New Gods live in two worlds, the world of New Genesis and Apocalypse. The two worlds are often referred to as Heaven and Hell, where High Father is the leader in New Genesis and Darkseid is the ruler of Apocalypse. This Fourth world resides in the fifth spatial dimension plane, which can be seen on the map of the multiverse by Grant Morrison. Here's a map of the entire DC multiverse, and here is New Genesis, and here is Apocalypse. This shows that these gods are beings from a higher plane of existence. They are literal gods, so it is pretty clear why they play such a big role in the DC universe. I will say that I've only scratched the surface of the history of the New Gods in this video, and that there is so much more background information on them that I could probably do a short series of videos pertaining to the entire history of the New Gods. I'm trying not to go too deep into the story of the Fourth World because I want others to have the chance to read it for themselves. But as I said, in this book, it collects comic book titles such as The New Gods, Mr. Miracle, The Forever People, and Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. Personally, for me, I really enjoyed the New Gods, mainly because I think the character of Darkseid is really interesting, and I was first introduced to him in the Final Crisis event. I also really like the Mr. Miracle title. We followed the character of Scott Free, which is a fitting name since he is a super escape artist, where he is able to free himself from a death trap at the very last second and escape without suffering any injuries. For the Forever People, there was not anything that stood out too much when I first read the stories. For me, I would prefer the New Gods and Mr. Miracle, but of course that is just my opinion. There's still a lot of good stories in here with the Forever People, which I did enjoy. The only comic book title some people might be on the fence about starting is Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. For me, not all of the stories of Jimmy Olsen were great, and there were some that I enjoyed, but not as much as the other three titles. Something else to mention about this Fourth World project Jack Kirby was working on was that for each and every one of these Fourth World titles, Jack Kirby had been writing, drawing, and editing them. To think that each month he was not only drawing 4 23-page long comic books, but that he was also writing and editing them as well. He was also aided by inkers Mike Royer and Vince Coletta, a name who you might recognize if you have read The Flash, The Death of Iris West by Cary Bates. The reason for not mentioning him in the video going over The Flash, The Death of Iris West is because I wanted to wait to mention him in this video. Although I didn't bring up Vince Coletta in the overview video, and The Flash wasn't the only other title he was working for, I thought it was interesting that the inker for the Fourth World also worked on the Flash title for a while. Even though I intended to step away from Flash comics for this video, I was still able to tie this all back to the Flash. Well, not really, that's an exaggeration. But another interesting tie to the Flash the Fourth World has is that several times throughout the book, Mr. Miracle considered himself the fastest thing alive, which I think is oddly familiar to the fastest man alive. Now at the time, Mr. Miracle does not know who the Flash is, or most superheroes for that matter, but again I thought it was an interesting connection to the Flash. Now before going into the Hunger Dogs graphic novel and the story from the reprinted issue of New Gods number 6, I do first want to mention that essentially at the time the Fourth World had ended after the publication of Mr. Miracle issue number 18. It wasn't until a little bit later that Jerry Conway became writer for the New Gods and eventually wrote The Return of the New Gods. This continued the story after the events of what happened in Jack Kirby's Fourth World, and this lasted until issue number 19 of the New Gods. But once Jerry Conway's run of the New Gods finished, Kirby was asked to come back and wrap up the Fourth World in the way he imagined it. Now, was he able to end his story in the way he wanted to? No. I won't say which characters, but throughout the book there was this final battle between the two New Gods that was hinted at, where one would fall to the hands of the other, but since those characters were pretty popular, the toys of them were selling well, and because DC wanted to use those characters for future stories later on, Kirby couldn't have either of them die. Now, I would have wanted to see Jack Kirby's final vision of the New Gods and how he intended to end the Fourth World, but in a sense it is kind of good that he didn't, since the New Gods have played a pretty big role in shaping the DC universe. After the New Gods by Jerry Conway, there were other titles pertaining to the New Gods, such as The New Gods by Mark Evner, which will get a volume 2 in April of this year, as well as The Fourth World by John Byrne. Now, it might be a little confusing having a book that is also called The Fourth World, especially with 3 books taking place in between the 2 Fourth World Omnibus books, and although I could do an entire Fourth World reading order, here's a general idea of the order that these books should be read in, with Jack Kirby's Fourth World coming first, and then The New Gods by Jerry Conway, then The New Gods by Mark Evner, with volume 2 taking place right after it, and then The Fourth World by John Byrne. But as I mentioned, after Jerry Conway's departure from the New Gods title, Kirby returned to write the Hunger Dogs graphic novel, and a story from the reprinted issue of New Gods number 6, which was intended to be a prelude to this graphic novel. I won't go into the events of what happened in either of the stories, since I want to leave it for readers to find out for themselves if they get a chance to read it. As we reach the end of the book, we get extras labeled as Motherbox files. These files contain profiles of each of the New Gods. There's also some concept art, as well as some uninked and uncolored art by Jack Kirby, which I think is pretty cool to see. But that wraps up the Fourth World Omnibus by Jack Kirby. Let me know if you plan to purchase any of these books I have gone over, and like I said, the New Gods comic book title can be confusing to follow, like most comic book titles, so if you want, I can eventually do a reading order for them. Next video, I plan to go over Final Crisis. Final Crisis is known as being a confusing event, which is why I'll also be covering all necessary reading, as well as background reading that can help add to the experience when reading the event. The reason for saying that I am planning on this being my next video is because with all the background reading for the event, it might take a little while longer to upload than usual. And the main reason the background reading may delay the video slightly is because I do not have all the background reading in my possession yet, and I'm hoping to read those before finishing the script for the video. So in the event that the video would be delayed, I plan on creating a video going over what my thoughts are for the Flash movie, and any Flash comic books that I might think would be worth checking out before seeing the movie. Another reason for the Final Crisis overview video release date being pushed back a little bit is because I'm planning on having 2 sections for the video. Now this does not mean 2 parts of the video, only that one section of the video will be non-spoiler for those who have not read the event yet and need guidance for what comes before the event and during, while the second section of the video will contain spoilers for those who have read it and may still be confused about the event. By the time I finish writing the script, it may turn out to be 2 videos, depending on how long each portion of the video is, but I'm aiming for one concise video. If there are any specific questions you might have for the Final Crisis event, comment them on this video and I will do my best to incorporate and answer them in the video, since the questions that you provide for me will help in the scripting of the video so I know what points to cover for the Final Crisis event. One last thing I want to mention is that I want to give a huge shout out to all the people who have subscribed so far, which would be 21 people at the time of scripting this video. Although 21 people is not necessarily a lot, especially by YouTube standards in general, in my introduction video to this channel, I said that I'm not looking for subscribers. The main intent of this overall project I am working on, being my YouTube channel, is to help new readers through the sometimes confusing Flash reading order, as well as the DC universe as a whole. If I was able to help you with the Flash reading order or anything that I've covered so far, these videos have been worth it and I want to acknowledge and give a huge thanks to all of you who have subscribed. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for the next video.